My guardians told me they couldn't afford a family trip. Then I found out they flew first class without me. I stayed quiet until my uncle smirked and said, "Maybe next time you should work harder." 5 days later, they weren't laughing anymore. I, 22 thought I knew what betrayal felt like until last month. Growing up in my aunt and uncle's house after my parents died when I was 12, I'd gotten used to being the afterthought. But this cut deeper than anything before. It started when my aunt mentioned the family vacation to Europe they'd been planning for months. I'd been working double shifts at the warehouse all summer, saving every penny for college, when she casually told me they couldn't afford to take me along. The trip was too expensive, she explained, and with my uncle's recent promotion still settling in, money was tight. I understood. I'd been the financial burden for 10 years now, so I nodded and went back to my room. The disappointment stung, but I'd learned to swallow those feelings long ago. I even offered to pick up extra shifts to cover the house while they were gone. My aunt smiled that practiced smile and said that would be wonderful. 3 weeks later, I was scrolling through my uncle's Facebook when my blood turned to ice. There they were, my aunt, uncle, and my 2 younger cousins, raising champagne glasses in what was clearly a first-class airline cabin. The caption read, "Living our best life. First class to Paris never felt so good." I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. First class. They'd flown first class while telling me they couldn't afford economy for one more person. The math was brutal. A first-class ticket to Paris cost more than my entire semester's tuition. I screenshotted everything before my hands stopped shaking. They came back tanned and relaxed, arms full of expensive souvenirs and stories about 5-star hotels. My aunt showed me her new designer purse from the Champs-Élysées, while my uncle bragged about the Michelin-starred restaurants they'd visited. My cousins complained about how cramped the first-class seats were on the way back. I stayed quiet. I smiled. I asked appropriate questions about their trip. Inside, I was calculating. The breaking point came 5 days after their return. We were at my grandmother's house for Sunday dinner, and my uncle was regaling everyone with travel stories. My grandmother asked why I hadn't gone with them, and before my aunt could spin her version, my uncle jumped in with that smirk I'd grown to hate. He looked directly at me and said maybe next time I should work harder if I wanted to afford family vacations. The room went quiet. My grandmother looked uncomfortable. My cousins stared at their plates. My aunt shot my uncle a warning look, but the damage was done. I nodded slowly and told him he was absolutely right. I should work harder. That night, I started planning. See, what my uncle didn't know was that his recent promotion had made him careless. He'd been bragging about his new access to company funds, his increased authority, his ability to approve expense reports without oversight. He'd even shown me his new company credit card, joking about how easy it would be to live the high life on the company's dime. He also didn't know that I'd been paying attention during his drunken rants about work, how he'd been fudging expense reports for months, how he'd been billing personal meals as client dinners, how he'd charged the company for his gym membership by claiming it was a networking expense. Most importantly, he didn't know that I'd been documenting everything. I spent the next 4 days methodically building my case. I had his social media posts showing expensive purchases that didn't match his salary. I had photos of receipts he'd left lying around. I had recordings of his boastful conversations about gaming the expense system. I had timestamps proving he'd charged the company for dinners on nights when I knew he was home eating my aunt's cooking. The trip to Europe was the crown jewel. I had proof they'd flown first class, stayed at luxury hotels, and eaten at restaurants that cost more per meal than I made in a week, all while he'd submitted bogus expense reports claiming it was a business development trip to secure European clients. But I didn't stop there. I remembered my uncle's laptop password because he'd made me help him with technical issues before. Late Thursday night, while they were at my cousin's school play, I accessed his company email. What I found exceeded my wildest expectations. He'd been systematically defrauding his company for over 2 years. False expense reports, inflated client dinner costs, fictional business trips, even a fake conference in Miami that was actually their anniversary weekend. The evidence was overwhelming and incredibly well documented thanks to his own digital trail. Friday morning, I composed 3 emails. The first went to my uncle's company's fraud hotline with a detailed report and all supporting evidence. I included photos, screenshots, receipts, and a timeline showing the pattern of fraudulent behavior. I made sure to mention that I was a concerned citizen who'd stumbled upon this information and felt obligated to report it. The second went to the IRS. If my uncle was defrauding his company, he was likely underreporting taxable benefits. I provided them with the same evidence package, highlighting the discrepancies between his reported income and his lifestyle. The third went to my aunt's employer. She worked in accounting for a nonprofit, and I discovered she'd been helping my uncle manipulate some of the paperwork. Her involvement was minimal, but enough to raise serious questions about her integrity in handling financial matters. I sent all 3 emails from an anonymous account I'd created at the library. Then I waited. Monday afternoon, my uncle came home 2 hours early. His face was ashen, and he was clutching a manila envelope. He'd been suspended pending investigation. By Tuesday, company auditors were calling him every hour. By Wednesday, he'd received notification that the IRS was opening an investigation into his tax returns. My aunt got pulled into a meeting with her nonprofit's board on Thursday. While her involvement was limited, the appearance of financial impropriety was enough for them to place her on administrative leave while they reviewed her work. I watched it all unfold with the same quiet patience I'd shown when they told me they couldn't afford to take me to Europe. The house became a war zone of whispered arguments and frantic phone calls to lawyers. My uncle aged 10 years in a week. He'd gotten sloppy with his fraud, assuming his promotion made him untouchable. The evidence was so overwhelming that his company fired him before the investigation was even complete. They also demanded immediate repayment of all fraudulent expenses, over $75,000. The IRS moved faster than anyone expected. They froze the family's accounts while they calculated penalties and back taxes. The house went up for sale within 2 weeks. My aunt's nonprofit terminated her employment after their review concluded she'd shown poor judgment in financial matters. But I wasn't done. I'd been accepted to 3 universities, but couldn't afford to attend any of them. My guidance counselor had mentioned a scholarship program for students who'd overcome significant hardships, particularly those in foster or guardianship situations. The application required documentation of financial need and family circumstances. I submitted my application with a detailed essay about growing up as a ward of relatives who told me they couldn't afford to include me in family activities while secretly living beyond their means. I included copies of their social media posts from Europe alongside screenshots of my own bank statements showing my warehouse job wages. I wrote about working double shifts while my guardians vacationed in first class, about being told to work harder while watching them commit fraud to fund their lifestyle. I won the scholarship, full ride to my first-choice university, plus living expenses. The irony wasn't lost on me. Their fraud investigation had provided perfect documentation of the financial disparities I'd lived with for years. Update 1. 3 months later, the full scope of my uncle's legal troubles became clear. The company pressed criminal charges. He pled guilty to embezzlement and was sentenced to 18 months in prison plus 5 years probation. The IRS hit him with penalties that totaled more than double what he'd originally stolen. He filed for bankruptcy, but fraud debt isn't dischargeable, so he'll be paying restitution for decades. My aunt found work as a part-time bookkeeper, but her background check issues meant she'd never work in accounting again. They moved into a small apartment across town. My cousins had to transfer schools and give up their private music lessons. I should have felt guilty. Instead, I felt free. My grandmother called me the week before I left for college. She'd heard about the family's troubles and wanted to make sure I was okay. I told her about the scholarship, about how everything had worked out perfectly. She was quiet for a long moment before telling me she was proud of how I'd handled everything. She also mentioned that my uncle had asked her to ask me for forgiveness. He apparently realized that his Europe trip posts might have been what triggered the investigation, though he never figured out exactly how. I told my grandmother I'd consider it. Update 2. I'm finishing my sophomore year now, and life is better than I ever imagined. The scholarship covers everything, and I've landed internships that actually pay well. I'm studying business and finance. Turns out I have a natural talent for spotting financial irregularities. My aunt reached out last month. She wanted to meet for coffee when I was home for spring break. I almost said no, but curiosity won. She looked older, tired. She apologized for how they'd treated me, especially about the Europe trip. She said she'd known it was wrong at the time, but hadn't spoken up. She asked if there was any way to repair our relationship. I listened to everything she had to say. Then I told her I appreciated her apology, but some things couldn't be undone. I explained that watching them post first-class vacation photos while telling me they couldn't afford to include me had been a turning point. It showed me exactly where I stood in their family hierarchy. She started crying and said she knew I'd been the one to report my uncle. She said the timing was too perfect, the evidence too comprehensive for it to be coincidence. I didn't confirm or deny anything. I just told her that actions have consequences, and my uncle's fraud would have been discovered eventually by someone. I suggested she focus on rebuilding her life instead of looking backward. As I left the coffee shop, I felt something I'd never experienced with them before: closure. My uncle got out of prison last month on early release for good behavior. My grandmother mentioned he'd found work at a gas station and was living in a halfway house. He apparently asked about me, wondering if I'd be willing to talk. I won't be reaching out. The scholarship program asked me to speak at their annual dinner next month. They want me to talk about overcoming adversity and achieving academic success despite challenging family circumstances. I agreed. It feels right to turn my experience into something that might help other students in similar situations. Sometimes people ask if I regret what I did. The answer is simple: I don't. My uncle committed fraud for years while lecturing me about working harder. He lived lavishly while making me feel like a burden for basic needs. He chose to break the law to fund a lifestyle he couldn't afford, and when he got caught, he faced the consequences. I just made sure those consequences arrived a little sooner than they might have otherwise. The best part? I never had to lie or break any laws myself. I simply collected evidence of crimes that had already been committed and reported them to the appropriate authorities. Everything that happened afterward was the natural result of my uncle's own choices. I'm graduating next year with a degree in forensic accounting. I've already been recruited by a firm that specializes in corporate fraud investigation. Turns out I have a gift for following financial trails and connecting dots that others miss. My uncle taught me more than he ever realized, just not the lessons he thought he was teaching. He showed me that some people will take advantage of others without a second thought, that family doesn't automatically mean loyalty, and that sometimes the only way to get justice is to take it yourself. Most importantly, he taught me that when someone shows you who they really are, you should believe them and plan accordingly. I'm doing very well now, better than I ever thought possible growing up in that house. The scholarship opened doors I never knew existed, and my professors say I have a bright future in financial crime investigation. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my uncle hadn't made that comment about working harder. Would I have stayed quiet about what I discovered? Would I have just swallowed the hurt and moved on like I had so many times before? I'll never know for sure, but I doubt it. The Europe trip wasn't just about money. It was about being excluded from the family I'd been part of for 10 years, then being mocked for my exclusion. That kind of cruelty doesn't deserve silence. I learned something valuable from the whole experience. Patience is a weapon when wielded correctly. My uncle destroyed his own life with his choices. I just documented the process and made sure the right people saw the evidence. Justice doesn't always come quickly, but when it comes thoroughly, it's worth the wait.